Hi everyone, welcome. Out here on my bench, you see this bus box. This bus box has red wiggler worms living in it. And this is a fairly old system, probably one of my older ones. In service now for 220 days. And it's gone 13 days now, almost 2 weeks since the last time we popped in here to feed them. The theme of the feedings in this system for quite some time now, soon after we started the system, was to deviate slightly from my normal method of preparing foods for the worms. And I don't go very much out of my way to prepare foods, but most of the stuff that is fed to my worm bins gets frozen before it gets fed to the worms. So that definitely helps in keeping the stuff around and preserving it for as long as I like, pretty much, before I get around to finally feeding it to the worms. And I think there's also a certain degree of benefit to freezing and then allowing stuff to thaw. It just seems like it makes certain types of materials that would otherwise stay fairly resistant to the breakdown process. It gets those materials kind of mushy and softens them up, and definitely seems to accelerate the breakdown process in most cases. Certain foods, it doesn't matter much whether they're frozen or not. Other things, it does seem to make a pretty big difference. Like potatoes come to mind, for example. Potatoes being something that grows underground anyway, so it thrives being buried. If you take potato bits that have not been frozen first, and you place them down into your worm bin with the intention of feeding your worms with them, those little bits of potato will simply think that, they're in a place where they're meant to grow, and they'll try to grow. And I guess over time, eventually, some sort of bacteria or something will get a hold of the potato and start working it down. But for a good amount of time, before it finally does start breaking down, it'll just start growing in your worm bin. You'll have little potato plants developing. So I do find that freezing foods helps a lot. And offhand, the materials that we're going to be feeding them today, which is just maybe 3 or 4, I don't even know how many banana peels are in here, but these were all just set aside and never frozen. There's also the core of a jalapeno pepper in there for them. That was going to be their feeding, and that'll actually be 16th non-frozen feeding that this system will have received out of the overall 18 feedings that it's received so far. So this will be, this will be the 19th feeding that the system has received, but those first 3 feedings or whatever didn't get frozen. It was at that point that we decided, hey, let's try this idea of not freezing their foods before placing them into the systems. And then for a while there, I even thought to myself, well, let's compound that. If we think that freezing helps with the breakdown process, but the stuff they're getting here is not frozen, that'll quite possibly extend the amount of time that it takes for certain things to begin breaking down. And then like I said, I compounded that a little bit by starting out with all kinds of things that are actually slow composting materials already anyway. So like this is just one of those things that got fed early on in the system's life, which was the stem of a Brussels sprout plant. And it was only a couple check-ins ago that the thing finally cracked. It was actually intact as a still the overall shape of it was still a tubular piece of stalk or stem or whatever. And then eventually a couple feedings ago it finally developed this crack down the long length of it and opened up, and I think that was sort of the beginning of the end for that thing. And I don't know if we'll bump into any other things that were placed in here that were expected to take a long time, but I thought there were other materials that were put in here that would be classified as fairly slow composting materials. And I'm trying to think what the last feeding consisted of. With the theme here being not frozen, it's usually vegetables and things like that, which do get oops, sorry, I just silenced my my smartphone over here trying to remind me of some of my planned activities for later in the day. So this here, I believe, might be a chunk of gourd. And there's very little of it left. We would always typically, start chipping away little bits of it and try to help it get to the point where it's no longer even identifiable as a leftover anymore. And this was also one of those things that got placed into the system early on. And if I had never chipped away at it and helped it along, it might still be holding together as a single piece of material. But at this point, there's just a little tiny chunk over here near the stem end of it, which is still kind of holding together, but all the rest of it has gradually been chipped off and integrated into the rest of the material in the system. And at this point, I suspect that we'll no longer be bumping into that leftover of gourd anymore after today. So I guess the only thing I'm sort of doing here is probing around to see if we can locate any other slow composting materials. There's one other object in here which is perhaps the slowest of them all, which we've not seen in a fairly long time, which is a cork that actually was placed into one of my outdoor worm systems long ago, many years ago at this point. And it's just been going with the worms from one place to another over the years. But we've been sort of casually hoping to bump into it in time. And it's just evaded our attempts at finding it recently over the past few check-ins. I've even kind of thought about the idea of dedicating some time to actually searching through this system to locate it. And whether that's worth doing or not, I don't know. It might be kind of fun. A lot of times I'll just go probing through the material anyway, just to see how things look and to help aerate the contents of the system. But I think it's time to proceed with giving them their yummy non-frozen feeding number 16, 19 feedings overall at this point, and all those top covering pieces of newspaper will just go right back on as they were, and even that coffee filter that rested out here as our so-called feeding zone indicator. But I've got these pieces of newspaper laying around, pieces of newspaper on which I lay out stuff like seeds and stuff, maybe cantaloupe seeds I think were drying on this, and before I put the stuff away to be stored before integrating them into my worm chow recipe, I'll just rest them out there and let them air dry for a number of days, and then I'll just dump that dry batch into a little jar where I've got the remainder of the collection waiting to get processed into worm chow. So I just started to see signs of these pieces of paper looking like they're getting pretty beaten up. So I thought rather than keeping them around and letting them get further beaten up, it was time to perhaps let them get eaten up and use them as bedding in our feeding zone today. So a lot of times we'll use bedding in my worm bins that's been shredded and dampened and mixed with leaves and other things and sort of prepared and processed to make it really easy for the worms to work it down. Here we're just going with very raw materials, just some paper. And back in the olden days, before I purchased a shredder, I would prepare most of my bedding just the way you see here, is just tearing the newspaper. And it's funny, like you see how straight those rips went? There is a grain to newspaper, and if you tear along the grain, you get these really nice straight strips. If you try tearing against the grain, the strips, you'll never be able to get a good straight tear. I remember in school when I was a kid, one of our art classes, we were doing paper mache, and I was just baffled by how straight the teacher was able to tear the newspaper, but she never revealed the secret as to how she was able to pull that off. And then once upon a time recently, I found a YouTube video or something like that that revealed the secret to getting nice straight tears when you want to rip up your newspaper into strips like this. So Perhaps some of you out there that were curious about how I was pulling that off, that is the trick. So, a good bit of fairly dry stuff. I've got my little squirt bottle here, which is not only just moisture for the worms, but it's also got some of that Mosquito Dunks BTI solution mixed into it. So even though we don't see any flying insect situations brewing here, I do like using this stuff sometimes as a preventative measure, especially when the situation is like what I've got going on here, which is one of my systems is presently experiencing a little bit of an invasion of flying insects. So really like to try to beat down that invasion and bring an end to it over in that other system, but I'd hate to see the flying insects make their way over into other systems like this one. And if they tried, then, well, it would probably be unsuccessful because of these treatments. So, 3 banana peels. Interesting, when I put banana peels in the freezer, they, for the most part, just turn black. But it seems like just keeping them around at room temperature and never freezing them, they maintain their color pretty nicely. So, I'm going to grab a little bit of this leafy matter, too, off the top surface. We had laid it out as top dressing to kind of give the worms some nice bedding material that we could later mix in. So I figured instead of trying to preserve it as top dressing materials, oh, let's not forget, we want to get some of these older foods back down here into the feeding zone too. And you know what, before we get too far along, I've got my crushed eggshell here too that we can include as grit for the worms. So good thing I look around before I get too far ahead of myself. Sometimes I forget stuff and then afterwards I just decide it's too late to do it and we're just going to skip it, but luckily we remembered to add the grit there before we covered everything up. So here again, as I till up the material out here on the edge, partially for the purposes of just inspecting it and aerating it and seeing how things look, I'm also at the same time casually trying to see if I can bump into that cork at some point. The cork is actually, for the most part, holding together in its original form. I mean, it is definitely showing signs of wear, but it's been a little while since we last encountered it, so I am wondering how it's coming along over the past few months since we've not really seen it. I mean, since it's not made a lot of progress over numerous years, it's fair to expect that when we do eventually encounter it, it's not going to look much different than the way we saw it last time it surfaced. And it does feel to me like we've been fairly thorough here. Going through the feeding zone pretty thoroughly, checking everything out, going down around the edges to see what we see. And still, no cork. During some of my previous videos, I did kind of allude to the fact that, like I said earlier, we might do a little focused search party, trying to see if we can eventually zero in on its location and then perhaps do a better job at keeping it with the rest of the foods so that we can continue to check in on its progress and see how it's progressing. But it looks to me like we're kind of at the finish line here, and once again, no luck finding the cork. But I would almost bet for sure that it's still in here someplace and that it will eventually surface. But I guess today's not the day. I was pretty sure we might bump into it if I got a little bit more thorough than normal, and I think I was a little bit more thorough than normal, but still, that cork is hiding. Or maybe the worms are trying to hide it from us for whatever reason. Yeah, tricky little worms. All right, everyone, that's it for the check-in now with the red wigglers on day 220, getting feeding number 19, really feeding number 16 out of the non-frozen feedings. A nice little assortment of pepper stems or pepper cores and banana peels. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.